The purpose of this video, or the objective, is to compare and order rational numbers. We've talked about the different forms of rational numbers, so today we're going to compare them and place them in order using a number line. You can see here that the student expectation 62D says that we need to be able to order a set of rational numbers arising from mathematical and real-world context, and this is a readiness standard, so we need to be fully prepared for these types of questions. Let's look at some steps for comparing and ordering rational numbers. Step one, the best thing to do is convert all of them to decimals. Okay, you're going to see some fractions, you'll see some whole numbers, or you'll see percentages and some decimals, but if they're all in the same format, such as decimals, they're easier to compare. Step two says to compare the decimals using place value. So you may need to be reminded, but we'll look at some decimals and how to compare them. And then we need to use a number line to compare negatives. So we will be introducing negatives in our rational numbers, so we need to make sure we understand how to compare them as far as which ones have the greater value. Okay, so let's go and take a look at example one here. It says to place these following numbers in order from least to greatest. You can see we have a decimal here of 62 hundredths. We have a fraction of 3/5. We have a percent of 68%, and then another fraction of 2/3. The best thing to do is to make sure all of these are in the same format, and we will use decimals. So let's start with converting 3/5 to a decimal. Remember, the way that we convert this fraction to a decimal is that we divide up. The way this is actually read is 3 divided by 5. So when we set that up, we have 3 divided by 5. Of course, you understand that 5 doesn't go into 3, so that's a 0. Well, we'll add a decimal and another 0 to continue working this out, and 5 goes into 30 6 times. So we have a decimal of 6/10. Or it might be best to add a 0 and call it 60 hundredths for the purpose of comparing it to, say, the 62 hundredths. All right, we have a percentage of 68%. Hopefully you remember that percent means out of 100, so that's 68 hundredths. Well, if we just read it, it is a decimal of 68 hundredths, 0.68 with the 8 in the hundredths place, 68 hundredths. If you've forgotten, it is a fraction of 68 over 100, which means to divide by 100. And the way that we divide by 100 is to move the decimal back 2 places, and it becomes 0.68 or 0.68, 68 hundredths. All right, let's move on, and we have another fraction of 2/3. Well, let's go ahead and convert 2/3 by, again, division. So we're dividing 3 into 2, or 2 divided by 3. That doesn't go, so we add a 0, put a decimal and add a 0. 3 goes into 26 times. 6 times 3 is 18. When we subtract, we have a remainder of 2. Well, we could add another 0 and bring it down, but we're back to 20 again, and you'll notice it goes in 6 times again. So the 6 is going to repeat. So here we have 66 hundredths, which is actually repeating. So it's 0.66. Well, now we have all decimals that we can compare. We have 62 hundredths, 60 hundredths, 68 hundredths, and 66 hundredths. So if we were to compare them from least to greatest, we would start with the smallest one, and it looks like the smallest one is going to be 3/5. So we'll write that 3/5. The next largest is going to be the 62 hundredths, so we can write that as 0.62, 62 hundredths. The next largest would be the fraction 2/3. And finally, we had the percent of 68%. So now those have been placed in order from least to greatest. All right, let's take a look at one more example. Here we have some fractions again. We have a fraction of 1/4 and a fraction of 1/5, but you will notice that this one happens to be a negative fraction. We also have a decimal here That's a negative as well. It says negative 28 hundredths. And then we have a percent as 20%. Well, let's go ahead and convert these to decimals. And the first one we have is a fraction of 1/4. Well, you may have that one memorized, but let's go ahead and convert that to a decimal. We could divide 4 into 1. Doesn't go. We could add a decimal and a 0. 2 times, that's 8. Remainder of 2. Add another 0. So you can see here that we have a decimal of 0.25 or 25 hundredths. So I'm going to write it above here. That becomes 0 and 25 hundredths. 0.25. Here we already have a decimal. It's a negative 0.28. Here we have a fraction of 1/5. It's a negative 1/5, but let's convert that real quick. You may have that memorized, 1/5. If you don't, again, we can always remember to work that out. 5 does not go into 1. We add a decimal and a 0, and 5 goes into 10. 2 times 5 times 2 is 10. So we have a decimal of 0.2 or 2/10, or maybe we could call it 20 hundredths. But that was negative 20 hundredths. And then here we have a decimal of 20, or I'm sorry, a percent of 20%. And again, same thing, when we have a percent, we want to convert it to a decimal. We can move it back 2 places because we're dividing by 100ths, because it is 20 100ths. So that becomes as well 0.20, but it's positive. Okay, real quick, let's take a look at, let's remember something about negatives. Let's say we were comparing a negative 4 compared to a negative 8. Okay, you may want to think that the negative 8 is larger because you know that 8 is more than 4. But if we think about this on a number line, let's say this is 0, okay? Then this would be negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, negative 6, negative 7, negative 8. Well, anytime we're on a number line, we're reading from left to right. Anything to the left is actually the smaller value. So in this example, very specifically, the negative 8 is actually less. The negative 4 is the greater value. That's because it is actually closer to 0. On the left side, the negative 8 is farther away from 0, so it's it has the smallest value compared to the negative 4. So, going back to our example, we have a couple different negatives we need to look at. We have a negative 0.28 or negative 28 hundredths and a negative 20 hundredths. Well, the smallest value on that one is going to be the negative 28 hundredths, because 28 is farther away than 20. So that would be our smallest value. And then we would have the fraction of negative 1/5, because that's a negative 0.20. Then we're into our positive numbers. Well, the 20% is a 20 hundredths, and the 1/4 is a 25 hundredths. So then if we were going from least to greatest, it would be the 20%, and then it would be the fraction of 1/4. So that's a combination of working with fractions and decimals and having to compare them, and also including the idea of negatives. So that's a look at comparing rational numbers.